And I am very happy to welcome Gary Hafer back to our PD series today. Gary is the John P. Graham Teaching Professor at Lycoming College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where he has been teaching students for over 20 years now. He recently published Embracing Writing, Ways to Teach Reluctant Writers in All Disciplines, and we are going to be offering a special discount for all of you today on his new book, which will be available to everyone at the end of today's session. I also would like to thank Carla Beard, the editor of WebEnglishTeacher.com, for partnering with us on today's webinar. If you are looking for valuable resources and all sorts of curated content to incorporate into your English instruction, I would really encourage you to check out her website. You can visit it at WebEnglishTeacher.com. And if you are on Twitter, make sure to follow her. She's always tweeting great resources. Her handle is WebEnglishTeach, and I will drop that in the chat in just a moment. So without further ado, Gary, it's all yours, and I will be on the line if you need me.
Thank you very much, Emily, and welcome. Toby Fulweiler once mentioned that faculty, particularly those who don't teach writing, sign up for writing workshops hoping for some magical solution to their grading problems. You know, that was about 20 years ago I heard that from him, and I don't know if that's true. But I do know that grading and writing mix poorly, and that all welcome any additive that makes the grading of writing a more soluble solution. However, I'm going to tell you at the outset, I do not have that additive. Only a subtractive. Let me explain. You see, there are so many factors, especially at the beginning when you look at competing constituencies that are involved in grading. And so the whole thing might be a little bit fuzzy. You know, I teach writing in every course, and it's a little bit like dentistry. Okay? This is the way people think about writing. And there's a lot of focus on the student, herself or himself, rather than also on the practitioner. But those are two constituencies. The practitioner himself or herself who is also doing the writing. So writer, professor, writer, student are really joined together. And so the same problem that the patient has, guess what? Academics have that same sort of problem themselves. So what's the answer to that? Is it more high-stakes writing? Well, guess what? We've tried that. In about 20 years, we find that there's more high-stakes writing than ever before. For instance, students are writing with more sources. There's a lot more research-based academic writing in classes. And this isn't just English class. This is courses across the curriculum. And argument is far more common also. We also see that essays are typically longer, and they're much more complex than they were all from 20 years ago compared with today. Now, we've seen about high-stakes damage through testing in reading. But, you know, reading and writing are also bundled together. There's also the problem of what's called neuromyths. Okay? These are things that practitioners believe to be true, but simply aren't. Okay? For instance, here's one on learning styles. Now, there's no data for the United States, but for European countries, for instance, which we were always hearing is more enlightened, 93% of teachers believe that learning styles have a direct influence on how folks learn. Okay? But we know from cognitive science that's not really true. There's some other data, too. For instance, here's a popular one that's almost a urban myth that we only use 10% of our brain. I'd like to add one more point in there. The best writers always think first and outline before writing anything. I wonder what that would be. Because in 23 years of teaching writing, I still hear the same sort of neural myths about writing. When we have just involved in grading all the things that we have to think about, particularly with writing, like calculations. How do you do scale? What about standard space? What about this thing called rubrics? How do you incorporate that with writing? And so here is a summary. We have a whole series of problems. There are lots and lots of expectations across all constituencies. And guess what? They don't match. There are a lot of high-quality studies on writing. But you know what? It's very hard to process that into a pedagogy. The fact that we know that the best writers plan their writing before writing, often with paper and pen, doesn't really show us how to teach that and how to reach all students. Then there are institutional histories. I was just thinking this morning about, I heard something on the radio about, such and such performed is good writing. Well, what's the context for that writing? And how about in our own school? There are certain institutional histories, or maybe we've been penalized through writing in some way, and maybe we've even been subject to that ourselves. All that factors into writing. And then, writing is very time-consuming when grading is involved. So let's think of grading as a metaphor, because it really is. All language is a metaphor. And if we're grading writing, perhaps we even have a double metaphor. My neighbor had his fence blow down, and the wall that was attached to it also collapsed. And so he brought somebody in, and what's interesting about this fence is that he's putting up now as a stone wall, is that everything is uneven. So he has to have it stepped and scaffolded, going up the hillside. And what it looks like right now, it's kind of ugly. You know, there's dirt, it's very messy, it shows the previous work that's been done, and it's kind of calamitous. But, you know, slowly but surely, as it's nurtured over time, it's starting to look pretty nice. In fact, it doesn't look anything like the foundation. Well, that's exactly the way writing works. I mean, look at this manuscript. Now, these are Pulitzer Prize winners. This one's even typeset already. That's supposed to be a final proof. Look at all the changes. Does that look clean? Even Edison's notebooks, if you read his notebooks, you can hardly make out what he's saying. It's not the penmanship. It's the quality of the writing. It's just like that wall. Now, we all kind of know that. But how do we work that into grading? One way to work that into grading is to cultivate good habits. A way to show how to work really, really hard. So maybe we could come up with a list of things. And that list might be, really quite productive. And so maybe when we're rewriting our summary here, I would have to add one more thing. Okay? Is that grading really inadequately captures how writers write. Because it's a fixed, summative, end of instruction sort of grading. So that's basically the problem, at least as I see it, and I've experienced it. And maybe you can relate some of that too. So let's look at the final grade. Remember, everything that students are supposed to do, doesn't matter whether you teach high school or college, it's all supposed to enter into that final grade. We know how absolutely impossible that situation is. So the best that we can do is to minimize grading so that we do it as few times as possible. Maybe only once. Here's an example. Let's take behaviors of writers, and let's say writers in your discipline, the writers that you know, or the writers that you admire in your own field. What are the kinds of things that they do? Maybe we could come up with a list. Here's a list of ones that I see that are typical of people in my field. And they have productive habits. They collaborate with one another. They ask other people to read their unfinished prose. They're able to repeat the assignment or whatever their scholarly interest is with writing. They're able to plan. They're able to think with writing, not think, then write. Their behavior is just like writers, whether they call themselves writers or not. And they do lots and lots of rewriting. Peter Elbow, 25 years ago, wrote a little piece that was distributed to UMass instructors on writing a contract for a B. And what he listed there were basic tasks. Later he published it as a full essay, but it didn't quite capture what I thought was the genius of what he had here in writing to his colleagues, because he stopped with only writing a contract for B. No contract for any of the other grades. He left that ambiguous. In linguistics, sometimes that's called a fuzzy boundary. And since he wrote that piece, there have been lots and lots of studies, popular ones, empirical ones, on the notion of practice and how important it is for the final product. Not just writing as a process. That information is 30 years old. In fact, we could even go back to Aristotle and see examples of that. But to see how learning occurs and how practice occurs are so closely aligned, why can't we get grading to parallel that? And plus now, we even have studies using an advanced kind of MRI of brain imaging that show how writers actually write. They actually got some volunteers who were able to do this. As you can see, it's a pretty uncomfortable position. And one of the things that they found from that study is that the experienced writers jumped right into the metaphor of language, whereas inexperienced writers had to practice more outside of language and come up with a story first. Now, where that's going to lead, it's too early to tell. But one thing that it does show is that process is very important, and that process has to be built on habits. Now, how is that going to help us with grading? Look at all these things. We're going to have to combine all of these. How can we possibly do that? And then make it understandable to our constituency, parents, other faculty, students, about ourselves. One way is to combine them into tasks and to use that language. Now, tasks will only take us so far. We can't get to the final grade that way. But it is amazing what we're able to accomplish when we teach tasks and have students complete tasks that will lead and guarantee them a grade of at least a B. And that's called the contract for B. Now, here's a way to look at it. Here's the grading of writing. Let's say we could put it in a big circle. Let's move it out. The first day we mention it. We show students what we're doing. And for the rest of the semester, we minimize it to the point where it's out of their direct view. And it's out of our direct view. Instead, we have something what Thomas Marzano calls instructional feedback. Now, that's very close to formative assessment. Formative assessment is where you're teaching at the same time you're assessing work. That does not necessarily mean grading. And in this case, I'm using assessment to mean non-grading. That doesn't mean you're not giving students feedback. Lots and lots of instructional feedback. More than they could ever get if you were grading all the time. And it becomes so close together. After a while, you can't even tell which is which. That usually occurs about after 3 or 4 weeks of instruction. Now let me show you how that works out. Here's just a quick rundown. So with formative assessment and instructional feedback, remember we're yoking those together. But summative grading occurs at the end of the semester. Okay? You can't get to that summative grade. You can't get to performance without the task and practice. Okay? And all the things that are part of learning and the new studies that have come out since the 90s on learning, like space repetition from Carpecci from Purdue University, and the whole notion of interval practice, and there's 4 major ones. That's probably for another webinar. But all of that, we need to valorize. Now, how can we do that with grading? Well, 2/3 of our work, at least 2/3, if we can have 2/3 devoted to that kind of formative assessment and instructional feedback, then we can turn it on its ear so that what's at the top comes to the bottom. Okay? It's the tasking that leads to the summative work later on. Okay? So we have low stakes, lots and lots of low stakes writing. Okay? All kinds of process which you can give feedback and is incredibly energizing to go through this. In fact, it's really helped fuel my own writing. It's something that I discuss more about in the book, but just by doing it, it really provides a structure for when students are coming up to the high-stakes kind of work like portfolio, tests, or final examination. Now, I think one thing that's kind of weak about these two categories is, and folks always ask me about this, what's the transition between the two? And the transition between the two is drafting. So the formative assessment that you're giving feedback, how are you going to get to that high-stakes assessment? You're giving students feedback different ways. You can do it through conferencing. You can do it through notes, quick responses. And remember, you're not doing grading of this. Okay? And there's very little bookkeeping. And students just take hold, and they work and work. And you help them with the draft, just like an editor would. So how do you develop this contract for the B? Now, for everyone, though, there will be certain things that will be different. But here's some suggestions. I'm going to move kind of quickly, but you'll have a copy of the slides and you'll be able to see this. First, you need to have habits of mind, as Newman called it in The Idea of the University. Goals for significant learning, which D. Fink, that's his term. Okay? And this is for a freshman English class. Okay? So the concentration really is on writing and reading their own writing. Okay? And that's what I articulate in the goals. You could have 5 goals, you could have 19 goals. But that's really where you have to start. Fink's book develops that really quite nicely. Okay? The next thing, after you have the goal, you just make like a tree diagram. Here's 4 pages of mine. This took me about 2.5 hours. You have 3 columns. The first one is, what do I really want students to be able to do by the end of the semester? What's the outcome? And then, how am I going to assess it? Now, I've seen a lot of folks put the learning activity next. But I think assessment is really what's going to drive that learning activity. So that needs to be next. And I find that the contract for B most assuredly satisfies most, if not all, of these goals, in full or in part. So that's one step. So what would the B contract look like? You try to start with tasks that can't be done wrong. This is Rosemary Dean's phrase from 30 years ago when she taught at City University of New York. To come up with a set of things that, if done, they can't be done wrong. So here's the list from the previous slide. You try to link them together, hold tasks, okay? And start small. Okay? So there were 4 things that I first started with when I began with the contract for B 10 years ago. I started with daily writing. And here's the rub. You must do it with students themselves when you're in class. They have to see that you're valorizing the process that you're asking them to do. So all the mistakes, all the dirtiness of erecting that wall, that fence, whatever it is, and no matter what the previous experience is, the messier the better, because students don't see what the process of writing looks like. They only see the end product, books and libraries. And they're all wonderful. But how did they come to be in that form? Daily writing can do that. Then there's a process called rewriting. And we don't have time to go over that today, but I think that's really a critical process. Then there's drafting and, of course, feedback. Not only receiving feedback from students' point of view, but also giving feedback. And I'd say stop at 10 that are fundamental. Okay? And then test them out. This is something that I discuss a little more in depth in the book. But here in the composition course, let me just show you some examples of a contract for B. So, again, you have to tell students when you're talking about the contract for a B, you want them to work really, really hard. Okay? It's not an evaluative test in the normal sense that they think in a summative way. Okay? And you keep repeating these words over and over again. Okay. Dr. Hafer, are these tests that can't be done wrong? I say, yes, that's exactly right. Okay? But they have to be done. You have to come to class. How many classes? Okay? How many deadlines do I have to meet? Those are things that you can start off with as just simply behavioral or non-achievement factors. Citizenship of learning, okay? And because that one is particularly abstract, and you're getting more abstract as you go down the list, give examples like I give here, okay? Along with one abstraction, enjoy, okay? How to give sharing and feedback, writing daily, working at structured writing. What I mean by that, do you notice I have all the terms in boldface? Those are the terms I use over and over operationally in class. I don't define them except in context, except when they're done by students. Do teaming, okay? And I'm trying some new teaming techniques this next semester in my class. But because it's brand new, I'm just doing it with one section to see how it turns out. I really believe in the whole concept of rewriting, and that's different than revising, okay, because it's all done on the sentence level. Copy editing and proofreading. Do you see the transitional move that I'm starting to make because I'm slowly introducing that? And that's something that'll be much more important when the summative part comes along. And then keeping a portfolio throughout the semester. In this course, I don't have a final exam. I use a portfolio as that. I keep repeating to the students, hey, I'm with you on this. I'm doing the same thing you're doing. Okay? So anticipate that they're going to want to know what their grade is. Tell them they'll know all the time because they're going to get so much feedback from you. And guess what? It's going to take you less time because you're not grading and record keeping and deciding is this an 88 or an 89. The importance of first efforts. Now, how about in a traditional class? Now, here's a pretty much a junior class on classical rhetoric. Okay? A real page turner, right? Okay. So I have many of the same things, but I have examinations in that course. So in that one, you can try a number of different things. One is, hey, there are two major exams. The first one is like a first draft, but the final exam counts double. So when they're averaged together, you should have at least an 85. that will keep B contract. Right. Or you could do something like this. If you score poorly on the first one, you can still make it up this other way, and you will still be in the contract. You're telling students all along, if they try really, really hard, you can guarantee them without rating the quality of their writing a B. But guess what happens when students start to do these things? That's right. Their work gets better. Okay? Because, as Don Murray says, good writing is accidental. And for me to add to that just a moment, good writers have more accidents because they're writing all the time. Okay? So all these kinds of factors can enter in. Now, how do you start? You start in your own notebook. Start in your own daily writing. Gee, don't miss more than blank number of classes. Now it's your turn. Let's take a break, just for 5 minutes. Could you specify what tasks you could come up with where you use writing in a course that would guarantee a B? Nothing final, just formative. See you in 5 minutes.
Hey everyone, so just as Gary referenced, just take the next couple of minutes just to think about what it is that you could specify for a minimum grade of B in a writing course. So one of Gary's things is that he likes to incorporate these reflective moments during the webinar, so do take a couple minutes just to think about that, and feel free to share your thoughts and ideas in the chat box. Hey, Gary, I'm not sure if you're able to see the chat box, but we have a lot of great suggestions coming in. So I guess when the time is up, if you'd like, I can rehash those to you and to everyone else during the session if you'd like.
That would be great.
Okay, you got it.
Now, I hope you see, folks, that what you're really doing here is coming up with a first effort. Okay. So how about that final grade? What happens there? Well, the B contract becomes the centerpiece of and takes over for the course, where you have students working with fuzzy boundaries and getting lots and lots of return. There's a piece called the post-write, where on the back of the sheet, I have students write how they're doing each class. And it only takes a minute or two. And the quality of the writing that's come through, which is really metacognition and meta-discourse, writing about writing, is incredible. Because the B contract provides formative assessment and gives instructional feedback, and all of those are yoked together. Well, once you have that, remember the metaphor of the wall? Well, you're drawing a metaphor so that they can understand what a final grade would look like and how it would be evaluated, something we call grading. So you have a box now. The B contract actually leads students into performing for the grade. So you can bring grading close to their experience by minimizing it during most of the semester. Okay? And you can show that those two are parallel. So the grade of B is for completing tasks. But while students are doing that, what sneaks up behind that is a kind of pride of accomplishment. And also the increase of expertise, because they're getting guided experience. They're not on their own. You're there all along. And it's scaffolded. And that's the way the grades above B are also. So you have the B contract, the contract for the B undergirding all of those, so that there's a step to really superior writing. Now, what about that transition thing that I mentioned earlier in doing a draft? Well, you can write a check sheet. Okay? A check sheet tells students what the tasks are. Okay? Like, I'm writing every day in my daybook. Yeah, they could check that. But guess what? It's the same sort of thing. There's a routine. There's a good habit. There's all things about trying. Okay? And many of those are instantly verifiable. You are telling them how the process works. Okay? Now that's, say, for a second draft. Here's for an evaluative paper that students were doing. I even prescribed the pre-writing and then rank these 5 areas: focus, development, organization, language, and conventions are pretty much equal. And you can use those as summative qualities at the end. But right now, you're only looking at tasks. And students move from the top to the bottom. Okay? The most important to deal with is focus after the pre-writing and planning. But all 5 of those are important. And then you develop transitional language. Once they're able to do something, like gather evidence for an argument, then you can start, you have 80% of the class with you. Okay? That's just like a bee. When you have 80% of the class beating it, you can turn those tasks into transitional language that move them towards something summative, something that's evaluative, like right here. I want a source that's reliable, authoritative, and timely. Okay? I wrote 2 versions of the opening paragraph. One's the original. This is an example of rewriting. Okay? Get students to do the writing and then explain what they did after they've done it. Use it inductively rather than deductively. And so the task of the practice that you have in the check sheet, like I tried to write a thesis statement, okay, transitions over to performance. I got 80% of the class writing a thesis statement. Okay, now I'm going to move it over here. That doesn't mean you're leaving the other 20 behind, but you're showing them the benchmark is moving up. So here you have the task. The tasks give access to that final grade. So F, D, and C are for those who don't do all the tasks. Okay. For those who do the tasks, you can evaluate their writing and you can give them feedback with respect to that if they keep the contract for B. So a student who comes in, pass alone will not get him or her any higher than a B. It'll stop it right there. And you can articulate in a syllabus or a document, how do you earn an A, an A minus, or a B plus? And how do you know where you stand? And that is the perfect opportunity to explain writing excellence after they're already working in writing. It's impossible to speak about writing without writing being produced. So you have one-time grading. You determine your goals first. You identify the tasks that mirror the habits. You translate those tasks into the contract for B. And then you nudge them all along, as Donald Graves called it, nudging students all along, lovingly, up that ladder for your one-time grade. So here's a quick summary. We can minimize grading without lowering standards. And that reduces the overhead and the absolute discouragement of doing grading all the time with writing. We can't eliminate it in most occasions, but if we can't eliminate it, we can certainly minimize it. We can also spend a lot more time because we're not doing grading. We can respond. We can give many more assessments. We can give much more feedback, and there is such an energy and a passion that will come through when you start responding to students as writers rather than recipients of grades. That's what lifelong learning is about. That's all part of inductive teaching. Okay. I taught writing deductively for 10 years. I am absolutely convinced it can't be done right. Minor successes compared to inductive teaching. Dealing with their work right there and moving them along, because that's how writers write anyway. Okay? And then, once those tasks are done, we can start transitioning them to produce better prose. Now, I know that's been very quick. I give more examples and examples from students in my book, Embracing Writing. Because you're a participant today in this webinar, if you go to jossybass.com/highereducation and use that code, HAE25, you can get a 25% discount from Jossy Bass and also postage paid. I'm also on the web. I welcome your comments. Sometimes it takes me a few days to answer everyone, but I'm more than happy to respond. Thank you, Emily.
Awesome. Thank you, Gary. Before we get to the questions, I did just want to share with you some of the task ideas that our participants submitted during those few minutes. So some of the ones that came in, tasks such as coming to class on time, asking questions during class, engaging in discussions. One person suggested the tool Poll Everywhere, which can be used instead of those clickers to ask larger groups questions or have them post questions. Things like reflection documents for students to complete after assignments, asking questions if they don't understand something, on-time completion, minimizing and or eliminating poor habits, giving credit for stages like pre-writing and exploring, so using things like cluster diagrams and building out lists of questions. And then one thing that came in from a few people was doing peer editing. And Elizabeth, who I believe teaches writing at the higher ed level, contributed, peer editing has always worked for me in the past, though some students want to be mean critical rather than helpful critical. So those were just some of the thoughts that had come in during those few minutes.
Oh, those are all excellent. I would say all those make the series of tasks that would work really well. As far as peer editing, I try to use Elbow's Believing Game and the Doubting Game, where students take on simple roles. The first thing I get them to do is to observe and to hear one another's prose and to be able to write about it very quickly in free writing. That teaches folks, all of us, to listen better. And you know what? That's a task too. So those are all great suggestions. Excellent.
And there were some questions that trickled in during the session as well. One person asked, Anita asked, do you have any ideas of how this type of instruction could work in larger classes? She mentioned that she has a class of 120 students, and she doesn't have any sort of teaching assistants. I know Lycoming College is relatively small, I think, so I'm not sure if you have any personal experience or maybe if you've read something about accommodating larger classes.
I think one of the ways that you can do that is when you have things like post-writes. I show some examples of this in the book. You limit the number of questions, okay? And you also limit as to where they're placed on the sheet of paper when students are doing reflective pieces. When they're writing papers themselves and you're treating it like that. Now, of course, it depends on what class. This book is primarily not written for English teachers, although I've heard a lot from English teachers, different ways that they've tried applying some of these concepts. One way that you can do that is to stretch out the process even more. You can use group work that's really focused, and you can show examples through workshop on how to do that. And you can process the content right inside the classroom. And having students do that I typically don't even see first drafts. They submit them electronically, and then they're finished. They're placed in there. And then when they come to class, we'll often, when there's 5 minutes at the end, we'll spend some time rewriting. So they get examples of rewriting. Okay, now do that for homework on your previous draft. And what they show and what they develop from the classroom experience where you start, it's tremendous. It takes over for itself. And that's the way real writers work. They have other people honor and look at their work. They hear their work read. In my experience, students don't have those rich kinds of context. You need to provide it for them so that they can take over when the class is finished.
Great, thanks. Kate had asked, do you look for improvement in certain areas such as things like spelling and organization in the low-stakes writing portion of your instruction?
Nope, I don't do that until we're actually looking at that and developing it. I mean, if you would see some professional writers and Pulitzer Prize winners, some of their work that comes in when there's just the first idea and they want some feedback, they would be embarrassed to show that widely, but they're only embarrassed to give it to non-writers because fellow writers know how hard writing is. But it can also be joyous once you realize what the process is. And things like organization, I have that in that analytics scale on the check sheet. That's something we do come to, and I do deal with that, and I deal with spelling. But I don't teach spelling words in class. The best place, because it's so individualized, it's got to be done inductively. To do it outside of that and to teach it as a class other than a strategy, it's a waste of time. You'll see the same thing repeated over and over. The greatest way to produce more error is to teach them classes on finding error. It's all counterinductive, and counterintuitive, but that's the way it works. It's got to be done inductively, and I wish we had some time. We could deal with that today. Maybe another webinar sometime, Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. One other question that came in from a couple people, and again, I'm not sure to what extent you can comment on this, but they were asking, how are you able to sort of apply these techniques with distance learning, or even just when people have instruction that's a little bit more computer-based? Do you have any feedback on that?
It is harder because on something like daily writing, which I really believe in, a lot of that is handcrafted. There's a physicality to daily writing that is really well suited to the classroom, and it's a lot harder on distance learning. I think it can be done, but it can't always be done at that moment. There are lots of ways of digitizing handwriting and showing that over the internet. I mean, Evernote has an app where they use moleskin notebooks to take photographs. I mean, I could envision a class like that. And why is handwriting so important? Because there's a cognitive action that happens there, the motoric form of learning. And that's really important. It's not important in everything. I mean, I'm no technophobe. I'm not a Luddite. I enjoy technology. But you know what? The pen and the paper are also technology. And those technologies have a certain advantage at particular places. You'll even find presentation gurus talk about going analog first shut the computer. The first thing you do is put it aside. Go somewhere different. Take out a pen. Take out a paper. Take Post-its. So it's very low tech. I think that kind of aspect, you have to seriously think about how some of those things could work in there. The other kind of habits would be very easy to show in chat rooms and that sort of thing. I'm not really in favor of bulletin boards and you know, assigning students to respond to 5 other people. I think that encourages a lot of plasticity, and I think what's better is, and some schools have done this, is have students develop their own blocks, which can be done without much technical knowledge at all, where they're actually commenting on things. And what are those things? They're digitized forms of daily writing. So those are very easy to use. That's what I'm thinking off the top of my head. And any other questions, Emily? I want to be able to get to everybody.
I think that was everything, and we are just a couple minutes away from the top of the hour, so I think now's a good time to wrap it up. But to everyone who is joining us today, you can see that Gary is pretty active online, so if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to email him or contact him on Twitter. We will be sending you the slides, so you'll be able to get all of his contact information again in the follow-up email. So don't worry if you didn't have a chance to write it down or make note of it during today's session. Again, as you can see, we are offering a discount for 25% off Gary's new book, Embracing Writing, HAE25, at the Jossie Bass website. Gary, thank you again. It's been a really great session, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope you found it valuable, and make sure to keep an eye out in your inbox for our follow-up email with all the resources that you'll need to continue learning.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks again, everyone. We will be doing our next PD session on Monday with Kyle Pace, who's an instructional technologist and technology specialist in Kansas City, I believe. He will be talking all about Google Drive, so slightly different topic this time. It's going to be more on cloud-based learning. If you're a Google Apps for Education school, you may be interested in attending that. We'll include that information in the follow-up email as well. Thanks again, everyone, and hope to see you at another PD session soon. Bye-bye.